Stan Efferding, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Absolutely. I did notice that you commented on one of our clips of Pat Davidson, Dr. Pat Davidson, talking about testosterone. And he mentioned
Yeah, I love
how,
talking. I love talking shit to Pat. I attended his seminar down in Florida. Sure is a brilliant guy.
yep. I mean, he goes to my local gym, incredible dude, just a massive dude. And I didn't know how smart he was until I started talking to him. But for those
Oh
that didn't see,
yes,
the clip is him expressing how whether you're a professional bodybuilder or just somebody on TRT, you really should never exceed 250 milligrams of testosterone a week. And your comment back was blasphemy, no such thing as too much testosterone. So I want to hear your thoughts about that.
yeah. That's just an old meathead that has been using testosterone replacement therapy or performance enhancing drugs for over 30 years to compete. I was diagnosed hypogonadal when I was 20 years old. I started training in college and I couldn't put on any weight. I was 135 pounds. And after 2 years of training, I competed at 154. So I was a skinny kid. And so I finally went to the doctor and got a blood test and found out that I was hypogonadal. I had varicocele, which is um, you're a vein that doesn't drain from the testicles. So it creates heat in the area. So it can cause hypogonadism. Not in everyone, but it is one of the symptoms. And so I started testosterone replacement therapy at the time. It was very effective for me. I started adding mass almost immediately. And then, of course, when you want to become a pro bodybuilder and you only weigh 160 pounds, one is good, three is better. You start playing with dosages and find out that there's kind of a dose response linear relationship in terms of how much muscle you can add on, how quickly with testosterone. I did a podcast with uh, Derek from More Plates, More Dates.
I was watching that before, yeah.
Yeah, and another one with Vigorous Steve, if you've heard of him.
No.
And I talked about, back then in the late '80s and early '90s, particularly as a college student in terms of affordability and accessibility, and living in a small town in Oregon, we really didn't have access to a lot of stuff. And we also perceived that, taking testosterone was going to kill you. And you just make those sacrifices because you want to be big. In one of my rants, I talked about that quote that Olympic athletes, if you asked them if they take this pill to get a gold medal, but they would die 5 years later, a pretty high percentage of them would. And that's the way we perceived testosterone at the time because of the perception in media and the after school specials about roid rage and your liver and all this other stuff. And uh, as it turns out, now we're discovering within reason that TRT for those people who have hypogonadism it actually improves all cause mortality and doesn't have a cardiovascular disease impact. But that's in normal use doses. But back then, man, if you had a CC attest, you could get really good results. That's 200 milligrams, 250 milligrams a week, depending if it was a sustanon. And we still see that today in research. But if you did two CCs, you could get significantly more results. But we thought that was a huge dose. And I talked about the difference between our perception in late '80s and early, at least mine, and those people that I knew in that small community. And I would use two cc's of sustanon and 20 milligrams of D-bol a day when it was available. And I was able to bulk up at one time to almost 300 pounds on
Jesus.
that dose. Now it was a fat 300. I was dirty bulking, but I got really strong. I deadlifted 782 in competition with no belt back in 1994, I want to say. And that was on two cc's of sustanon and 20 milligrams of D-bol a day. That's what I was taking. It was extremely effective. And I thought that was a lot. Well, then fast forward from 1997 to 2006, I didn't compete at all, and I didn't use any performance enhancing drugs or TRT. And in retrospect, now I've talked about it many times, as someone who was hypogonadal, that was a trying time. I talked about in my video "Stress for Success" about some of the stress I was undergoing and how much weight I lost and how crappy I felt, and had some anxiety and the like. A lot of that was business related. So for 10 years, I didn't use any testosterone replacement therapy, and it was thinking back on it now, it was, I didn't feel very good, but I didn't want to use testosterone because I wasn't competing. And I just presumed that it was more of a health risk. I didn't have the knowledge back then. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have access to the current research to show that hypogonadism is worse than testosterone replacement therapy.
Were you getting blood work at this time? Like, did you know what your numbers were?
No, not throughout those years. Now, prior to that, when I was competing, yes, I was getting blood work reasonably consistently. And so I was able to see kind of what was happening as I gained and lost weight, which I did a lot more frequently when I came back to bodybuilding in 2006. I came back to competing in bodybuilding and powerlifting. 2006 competed, and then again in 2008, and then from then forward, pretty frequently through 09, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, when all those videos were being made and all the records were being set. I got my pro card and all of that. But things changed when I came back. And, initially I started using the historical doses, but as I started consulting people that were in the know at the time, and I started training with Flex Wheeler, 500 milligrams became a gram just for bodybuilding.
Jeez.
And it was very effective. That was a gram a week, which, at the time I thought that was a lot of stuff. And I got a pro card on that, IPB pro card. Keith and I trained together. We had the same protocol. It's in my ebook, exactly what I used during that time. And I thought that was a lot of stuff. Well, then I got my IFBB Pro card, and I went over and visited Mark Bell, and I find out that that wasn't very much. And I had these aspirations to set world records in powerlifting. I had totaled 2,070 on about a gram a week of gear, which I still think is a lot of gear. It's part of this conversation is couched in the fact that in retrospect, I think I at times used too much and it was unnecessary, and that you could get great results from even 500 milligrams, but certainly a gram a week. But the industry started to believe you needed more. There were circulating saying that 2 grams was magic and the like. So I went and met with Mark Bell, and everything went to hell from there. It's a bunch of big power lifters, and next thing you know, you're using 3 grams. I mean, very quickly. Went from 1 gram a week training with Flex to worked my way up to 3 grams a week over the course of the next 7 weeks to win a world record in powerlifting. I had dieted down to probably 5 or 4% body fat. I was the leanest I'd ever been when I won my pro card training with Flex. And then over the course of the next 7 weeks, that since I went over and started training with Mark in Sacramento, until I set my world record, I had gained over 35 pounds. A lot of that's rebound, of course, from the bodybuilding to power to bulking back up. But I had jumped my doses way up. Now, I did set the world record. I did improve my lifts across the board, but there was a considerable amount of technique involved with that. Mark had changed my squat technique, and where I was used to struggle with 765 pounds squatting, all of a sudden I was squatting 820, 830, 840.
What was that? What was the big change there?
Well, I did used to have my feet closer together, and I would drop deeper into a lift with knees over toes. You can look at people can just YouTube my 2070 total, and you just stand Efferding 2070, and you can watch my squat. A, it was walked out. B, it was incredibly deep, ass to heels. C, my stance was kind of a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, and we had a decent amount of knee flexion. Mark changed that to use a much wider stance. I was pretty glute dominant and had really strong spinal erectors, and so the wider stance and a more vertical shin lent itself better to where my strengths were, because I did not have huge quads. And so we did a more vertical shin. We brought the depth up to just what was necessary to pass, which there's certainly plenty of reason to think that the SPF guidelines were more generous than some other federations. I look at my squats. I had camera angles from 3 different angles just to make sure I was getting to depth, but it's certainly not, an IPF standard. But all those things considered, plus if you watch this might be too much information, but if you watch the video of my 2070 lift, you'll notice that when I did my bench press and racked the weight, I got up and I was holding my arms. I had acquired a pretty serious case of tendonitis from low bar squatting with a close grip like this. And all of that compression and loading and training had made it just so that it was just on fire. My elbows were. When I went and trained with Mark, we went with the wide grip. We went out here and we used an SSB bar about every other training session. And for benching, we used boards and a slingshot. So this elbow pain started to go away over the course of the next many weeks. And I think that inhibited my top end bench, because I had benched 585 in the gym without pain somewhere around 2008. But then I started acquiring the pain when I started throwing in the squats and having that problem with the compression. But as I got more pain, it impacted how much I could bench. And so Mark changed my training such that I could train pain-free, but still be under the loads necessary in order to perform on the platform. And so my elbow tendonitis went away and I was able to get another 20 pounds out of my bench press. So coupling the 50 pounds from my squat based on the form change, vertical shin, wider foot angle, and the 20 pounds from the bench, deadlift was pretty much the same as what I had deadlifted 20 years prior in 1994-ish, thereabouts. I set the world record with the 22-21 total at the time in sleeves, no reps. But I was using 3 grams at the time, but I guess the point of the conversation this is kind of the broader point of the conversation. I don't think it was necessary. And I think that it was most certainly deleterious to my health, because I was getting blood tests throughout all the time and I could see a significant elevation in liver enzymes, LDL elevation, you get dyslipidemia, blood pressure elevation, all of those things. Obviously, creatinine is always kind of going to go up because you're taking creatine and lifting heavy, but it wasn't alarming as far as the kidney impact on the blood test. I didn't see, BUN and EGFR wasn't egregious, but that was also a very short window. This is one of the reasons. I know I'm blathering on, but let me just finish with this before we get into some more questions. I would only utilize those doses around powerlifting competitions for, 8 to 12 weeks at most. In that instance, it was 7 weeks. But at most, I would do 12 weeks and I would ramp up to that dose as opposed to just blasting from the day one. I would gradually build up over the course of 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. And then I would diet down to do bodybuilding. And so I would use less gear. I would get rid of a lot of body fat. I would be doing more volume and frequency and just generally a better conditioning type of thing. And I would see in my blood test that my numbers, my metabolic markers would all improve as well. Blood pressure would go down, lipids would improve, simply from the dieting and exercising and losing weight in particular. That was one of the reasons why I had so much longevity in the sport, and one of the reasons I encourage a lot of the big powerlifters, strongmen, football offensive linemen to periodize their weight with their strength season or competitive season as well, rather than trying to stay heavy year round. And that way they can try and correct some of those things and build more longevity in their sport. So I know I covered a lot of stuff there, kind of rolled on, but
no, that's great, Sid. And so talk us through, you're on 3 grams of test. You mentioned your blood work didn't look great. What did you feel like?
Oh, you feel terrible, particularly when you introduce orals. That's another thing. I wouldn't use orals, and I would only use them the last 4 or so weeks, 5 weeks before a competition. Now, in bodybuilding, it was usually Winstrol for the last 4 to 5 weeks. In powerlifting, it was usually Dianabol. I tried Anadrol at one point. I got migraines, and so I abandoned it. But usually it was Dianabol was the oral. And the problem with the oral is it hits your liver, as you know, from the 2-pass system, and that caves your appetite and makes you really tired. you get tired from the weight as well, and we know that body fat is inflammatory just by itself. We used to think it was a dormant tissue in the body, but now we know it has its own metabolism, and it releases inflammatory cytokines into the system and elevates HSCRP, homocysteine, and C-reactive protein. So it makes you really tired as well. Growth hormone was another thing that makes you very tired and insulin resistant as well. I could never take a lot of it. It would make my hands go numb, and I would get insulin resistance. My blood tests would start to see my HA1C elevate. And that always alarmed me because I did have friends that ended up becoming diabetic from too much growth hormone usage. So the combination of those things, I was exhausted. I shot a video at the time. It was Proving It DVD. I had a film crew come in and track the whole thing from my bodybuilding to my powerlifting record. So really, they followed me into the gym and home and eating, and we did the whole 9 yards throughout this process. And they came to the show, and when that I competed in at the time, I think it was the Ironman Pro that they followed me through, my first pro show. And I just remember I watched the video and I see the process from when I was heavy, when I was doing the powerlifting, and like my face was the size of a basketball and purple, and my eyes were practically swollen shut. And I can remember feeling really tired 23 hours a day. Then I would go to the gym and start touching weight, and it's like a light switch flicked on, and I would just crush everything. And I had this euphoric sensation. That's when I was doing the videos with the 200-pound dumbbells. I was just cranking out reps and 500-pound incline press. And I mean, it was just insane. I would just load everything onto the leg press. Nothing felt heavy. I could train, and then I would just feel incredible walking out of the gym and getting in my car. And then I'd get to a restaurant and sit down, and 15 minutes later, it would just like a wave would just come over you. You just feel this sense of exhaustion, just physically and mentally.
Now, compare that feeling to being low testosterone.
Yeah, low testosterone, I think the biggest challenge with low testosterone is just the brain fog and the fatigue, hard to recover from workouts. That was the neat thing about training on testosterone is that you would have these incredible workouts, plus you wouldn't experience as much DOM. And you would recover quickly and go in again. So you could train more often, you could do more volume, you could lift more weight. It's kind of the feedback loop from all of that.
Yeah.
It just, made the whole experience more enjoyable. You get better pumps, which of course now we know that doesn't necessarily drive hypertrophy, but it certainly felt good. And so that was probably the big thing. Harder to hold on to lean mass when you're hypogonadal, of course, and you see a little increase in body fat, maybe some disruption in sleep. A whole host of, I never experienced really bad libido, but the libido on testosterone was significantly better.
Yeah.
And of course, now most of us use a small amount of tadalafil or Cialis, a 5 milligram daily tadalafil, which helps with a lot of things, vasodilation, joint health, endothelial health, and it also helps with libido. And it doesn't, a lot of even longevity doctors who aren't in the HRT space talk about the benefits, the metabolic health benefits of it for the general population. So it's pretty commonly that's used now, but you just feel better. I'm reluctant to recommend pharmaceutical interventions to folks who don't need them, but there are some products out there that seem to have a lot bigger upside than downside now. We see the same thing with, I think it's telmisartan, the blood pressure medication that a lot of powerlifters and strongmen use, has some health benefits as far as, cardioprotective benefits for the heart to minimize, left ventricular hypertrophy, et cetera. So, I mean, there are some, there's some medications out there that should definitely be considered for those people who are subjecting themselves to, those health problems.
Sure. I mean, that's why you're so big on blood work, right? So you better understand where you're at and
Yeah.
how you feel. You mentioned you don't feel great high test. You obviously don't feel great low test. Where did you feel your best? Was it during like the off season of both sports, or did you find like a happy medium anywhere?
Yeah, I felt pretty good on bodybuilding. At a gram a week, I felt pretty good all the time, and my health markers looked pretty darn good. Uh, but you could experience a little bit, depending on the individual. You know, a gram a week might increase uh, acne, might increase hair loss, might increase water retention and blood pressure. And so, I mean, that's to me, that's still high for a recreational user. We do see in the research, again, as mentioned, that 125 milligrams a week does not show a significant improvement in hypertrophy as compared to somebody who has a naturally normal testosterone.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, remember there is the feedback loop, and so if you have a normal testosterone natural, and you decide to add TRT, even though
Sure.
it's potentially unnecessary, maybe you don't have the symptoms associated with it, but you want to improve performance, you're shutting your own system down, so it's kind of a replacement at that point. But when we got up to 250 milligrams, certainly at 300 milligrams in the research, you saw a significant improvement in adding muscle. And it was linear all the way up to 600 milligrams. And we didn't see a lot of adverse health effects at that dose. And so when someone consults me, that either they're using testosterone, but they might not have been hypogonadal when they started, or they're on HRT or TRT, if they're really pursuing a supraphysiological effect, if they really want to gain a significant amount of muscle, more so than what they were realizing from being, just in the normal range, I still think they want to be around 1,100 to 1,500 total tests a week, and that might take 200 to 300 milligrams a week.
Right.
And that's no longer TRT. That's certainly performance enhancing drug amount. If we're going to draw
Sure.
if we're going to shade in a line somewhere, draw a line in the sand, you would certainly suggest that was more. Lane Norton, who's lifetime natural, had a blood test. He had 1,100 testosterone. He performs
insane.
quite well at that. Yeah, it's a natural testosterone. So now, that's not to say that testosterone fluctuations within the normal range don't seem to impart a significant performance benefit. The difference between, say, 400 and 800. We see Olympic athletes, on average, when they get tested for testosterone, are in the lower end of that range, 300, 400, 500. A lot of that probably has to do with the amount of training, hard training that they're doing, and the stress and sleep and travel associated with competing at that level. That certainly impacts testosterone. Just kind of some of the overtraining as well. But having said that, these are some of the people who are performing, the best in their respective sports, and their testosterone isn't outrageously high. It's somewhere in the normal range, and generally around 400. So that's why I say that testosterone boosters, natural testosterone boosters, they just don't show, even if they show an increase in testosterone, generally it's the difference between, say, 400 and 450, or
Right, it's not
500
doing
and
much to you.
550. Yeah, it's not taking you from 400 to 900. There's no natural remedy that does that. It just doesn't. I know they claim 150% increase in testosterone, but understand that that's relative to someone who isn't using the supplement. And they might go from 400 to 410, while the person using the supplement goes from 400 to 450. So if you're comparing those two, you'll see a 400% increase in testosterone. But that's that's not the actual increase in testosterone. And again, there's no outcome research to show that you're getting improving strength or lean mass or performance in any way from those. So,
got it. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Lane Norton. So Gavin actually is an IPF world champion at 93 kilos, so he has to stay natural and has been working. Do you still work with Lane?
Yeah.
Still works with Lane. Obviously, he can't take anything. You mentioned like these test boosters, they're just not doing much. what would you recommend for somebody to, if they do have low testosterone or just to optimize their levels, what should they be doing?
Well, a lot of times I mentioned it's overtraining. This all goes back to load management. We spent the last decade talking about how to recover from workouts and how to minimize DOMs with either passive or active therapies and nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. But now that pales in comparison. I've always said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now all the focus is on load management. All the focus is being cautious not to overreach and put yourself in that position to begin with. And as mentioned with the Olympic athletes, they tend to put themselves in that position with their training. And fortunately, we're seeing some good research that shows that you can train a little less and you don't have to train as close to failure. You can leave more reps in the tank. And the frequency is probably more important than volume, at least with respect to how fatigue is measured. There are athletes like Lane can handle an extraordinary amount of volume. And it's kind of how the Bulgarian system worked for a long time. They'd run 100 guys through this high volume training and 90 of them would drop out with injuries or, and the 10 that survived were really your hyper responders to the loading, and God bless them. But if you're giving advice to the general population, you'd suggest not undersleeping and not overtraining. And if you're trying to make weight, not overly restricting calories for too long a period of time. There are some things, maybe boron, zinc, magnesium. There are some things that you want to check to make sure you're not deficient in them. So a little bit of benefit from creatine, which can be huge for a natural athlete. For some, depending on what their diet looks like, you can get a lot of that from diet, but not quite the dosage you can get from supplement. But there aren't a lot of things to naturally boost your testosterone. I think a lot of the damage that we do there is self-inflicted, as mentioned, from load management and from poor sleep, and maybe from dieting and stress.
Understood. Speaking of load management, when you used to train with Flex, I believe that was like the transitionary period for you. There was no such thing as load management, correct?
No, and that's the thing about guys using performance-enhancing drugs. You cannot design a program for a natural and compare it to, everything works. We have, right. It's like putting the bumpers up at the bowling alley. You've got a lower minimum effective volume and you've got a much, much higher maximal recoverable volume that you can. So, you can just do whatever you want and you're going to get results from very little training to a whole ton of training. And you don't necessarily have to train harder, but yeah, Flex's program was 2 a day. It was push, pull, legs, Monday through Saturday. And each day was 2 sessions, one in the AM, one in the PM. And each workout was 4 exercises, 4 sets of each. So we did 16 sets for quads on Monday morning, and then we did 16 sets for hamstrings on Monday night. And then the next day would be 16 sets for chest in the morning, and it would be 16 sets for shoulders and triceps at night. And then the next day was 16 sets for back, 4 exercises, 4 sets of each. Now, I can't say that we reached the level of effort that I know, and the research shows us now that you can actually have a higher level of effort on the first couple of sets. And from there on out, just psychologically speaking, you're unable to perform to that same degree. That's another thing about steroids is that your perception of effort, you're just able to do a little more because you're kind of jacked. It's kind of like people would take adrenaline or they would take caffeine, or caffeine's a known ergogenic aid, and part of the reason is that it decreases your perceived level of effort, which is a huge determiner of your ability to recruit muscle tissue and to do reps. Which is why I don't like people going to the gym hungry, because any distraction at that point starts to decrease your output, your effort in the gym. So. That was hard. And you also find that if you're tired, you'll start saving yourself. You won't put as much into the earlier sets because you anticipate everything that you have left. Now we know that you probably get maximum benefit. It seems like we get significantly diminished returns after, I want to say, 5 sets for a particular body part in a given workout. But frequency becomes more important. I know people talk about bro splits, and you would go in and do a push-pull legs Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whatever. I don't know anybody who did that. So back in the early 90s, when I used to drive down to Gold's Gym Venice and watch the pro bodybuilders and talk to them and ask them about their programs, they were all training body parts twice a week, every single one of them. Now they're probably doing more volume than was necessary, and they could recover because they were on performance-enhancing drugs. But I think we know now from the research that frequency is pretty important. That anabolism and hypertrophy really only occurs for about 48 to 72 hours, and then subsequent to that, you're having catabolism, or you're starting to break down muscle tissue, and so you kind of want to re-stimulate that more frequently. Doing 9 sets once a week is not as effective as doing 3 sets 3 times a week. And the 3 sets, you're able to pour so much more into them, and you have less fatigue, that you're recovering better. So that's just the difference between what you can do on performance-enhancing drugs and what a natural athlete should do, based on what we know about the science today.
So when you're mentioning, for the people out there, you say 10 sets total for the week, right? Let's say for chest. You're splitting that up into different movements, though, correct? You're not just doing 10 sets of bench.
Yeah, I'm saying that, correct. I don't like to do more than 2 sets of a particular exercise, because I think that, I think we see from the literature as well that you get it's a significant decline in return on that investment, in terms of muscle protein synthesis or motor unit recruitment. You kind of maximize your ability to create stimulus after about 2 sets. You probably get it with one on one exercise, and then switch to a different exercise that might hit the same muscle group from a different angle.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I kind of generally now, I start on the low end, and I'll only add exercises and sets if someone is not progressing. And by that means they're not getting 1 more rep or 5 more pounds week over week, or, it's not linear, but just generally speaking, if they aren't beating the book, then I might add volume. If they've already got a lot of volume and they're not progressing, I'll take some away.
Yeah.
But I like to keep frequency and intensity high. And so I might do full body 3 times a week, 2 sets, or 2 exercises, 1 set of each. That to me is a pretty good starter program.
Okay. And how close to failure are you bringing these movements?
For powerlifting, I'll leave 3 reps in the tank.
Interesting.
The closer you get to reps in reserve to failure when you're powerlifting, the slower the weight moves. That's not a right stimulus, and the loads are heavier. You do need to use heavier loads because strength is specific, and so you're going to want to be 85% of your 1 rep max or north of that, and occasionally throw in a 90%. You don't want to max out. And I've known this for a long time. I attended seminars and trained with Mikhail Koklev many years ago, and for those people who don't know, he was a legend in Olympic lifting, powerlifting, and strongman. But he would only do about 85% of his 1 rep max, and he wouldn't grind reps if they didn't move reasonably fast. I think Lane and Mike Teixeira both measure bar speed. I think they've done it enough now to where they can auto-regulate. They know if something's moving slow or fast, and they won't try and grab more reps in a set if it's moving very slow that day. But generally speaking, I'm at about 85% of your 1 rep max for a triple, whereas you could grind out 5. And then I would do, try and do a few sets there. I would rather do less volume more frequently. I think the folks at Barbell Medicine train in that fashion too. Jordan Fagenbaum would pull 3 times a week sometimes. I could never replicate that with the amount of load and volume that I used to use. And so you would have to cut back and have less fatiguing sets in order to be able to recover. And you'd have to build into that. You couldn't just go right out of the gate, 3 days a week, powerlifting stimulus.
Sure.
And we see that, elite Chinese weightlifters, Olympic lifters, doing 11, 12 sessions a week. But they aren't maximal loads. They're not squatting their 1 rep max. That's what people don't realize. And so most of what they do is both speed and strength, but they're not anywhere near. They might only be 70% in terms of their 1 rep max, maybe even a little less.
Got it. I mean, Gavin, you're 4 weeks out, and we just talked about how you will touch a 1 rep max maybe once or twice in your entire 8-week prep, no?
I probably won't aim to PR a 1 rep max. In training, we kind of push that towards the meet, but during our peak, to Stan's point, we are absolutely holding. We has to be at least 85%, and those jumps may change. And the idea is to build momentum block to block. But Stan's absolutely right. Like, we'll never try and push these sets to some crazy degree of failure. Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important and we used to try and pull a PR before a meet to see if we could do it. And that's just bad advice. Yeah, I mean, you don't run a marathon 2 weeks before a marathon.
Yeah. We just used the same example before, yeah.
Yeah, it's just dumb, but that's the way we used to do it. Back in the 90s when I was lifting, we'd go in and max out every week. You'd work up to, and sometimes you would miss. You'd have to have a spotter help you. They were actual failures. And then you'd work up and do a single rep max, and then you'd drop back down to do your hypertrophy volume. That's the way we used to train at night. And a lot of that was probably very unnecessary, maybe even counterproductive. We still like to see the weights move fast. I think one of the biggest things that I had a hard time getting my mind around, and when I tell people who don't have the information that we have, I understand that it's going to take them a while to comprehend it. But I don't know if he created the saying, but I always credit Jordan at Feigenbaum at Barbell Medicine for saying, you don't add weight to get stronger. You get stronger so you can add weight. And it's like you don't force adaptations.
Yeah.
You're able to progress because the adaptation has already occurred. And that's why I'm saying a lot of people who auto-regulate based on how fast they're moving weights as they work up to their top set, you can kind of tell, is today the day I'm going to be able to grab that extra rep? I don't grab the extra, I guess another quote that's often said is that if you lift a heavier weight slower, did you get stronger? And the answer is no. So you kind of got to be patient. So what I always liked about the Russians is they were so patient. I watched Mikhail Koklev lift at the Arnold Classic one year, and everybody goes in there to max out. Mikhail was training for a meet, and he had 8 weeks till the meet. And so he only went in and he pulled 765 for a double maybe. We've seen him pull 400 kilos for a triple.
Yeah.
Right? And he stopped there, and I was impressed with his discipline, that he didn't pull anything heavier because that is where his progression had him at that point in his block leading up to his competition. And he didn't see the need to show off to anybody there.
Yeah. For powerlifting, it makes a ton of sense. You don't want to kind of, I guess, max before you really have to max. But talking about bodybuilding, right, or just the general person that wants to look better week after week, do you think they have to ramp up intensity a bit more and do have to start flirting with the run net maxes?
We do see one extra rep. I don't think they have to go to failure. They could certainly leave a rep in the tank. The frequency and the effort and the progression all matter. I think frequency is still the foundation because of the anabolism catabolism cycle. If you just train once a week, you're going to pretty much have regressed from any gains that you would have made from the previous week's training. Yeah. And so you need to get a more frequent stimulus than that. But in getting more frequent stimulus, you have to be cautious that you don't accumulate so much fatigue that you can't recover in 48 to 72 hours. As I've aged and my ability to recover has declined, I have to be careful with my frequency and my fatigue. And that even goes down to things like I would do a chest supported row before I would do a bent row or a T-bar row because of the less impact on my lower back. I might use a bench machine as opposed to a bench press, largely because, and I'm the guy who's, I'm an old power lifter who thought that squatting was the world's greatest exercise. And I would even think it was better for sports because I said you had to balance the load and, you recruit more muscle tissue. But in fact, as Pat Davidson, you don't, it doesn't transfer. You don't do sports specific training and try and combine sports movement with load. You don't get the benefit, the maximum benefit from either. And so you do them separately. In the gym, you just force production, and then on the field, you play your sport. Yeah. And so now I'm inclined to do and to recommend exercises that are more fixed in nature, because there's less variability, and you can more easily measure your level of effort. And now whether you add 5 pounds or you add 1 rep, you can see it's consistent with the way that you performed the exercise in previous weeks, and you weren't starting to, do stripper squats and, bouncing out of the hole and speeding up the tempo or shortening the range of motion. All of those things are ways that you could cheat a rep. But we try and, normalize the movements from week to week so that we can be honest about whether or not we're getting a progression.
So staying with that, for, you mentioned for somebody like you're moving more towards these fixed movements like a chest supported row versus a barbell row. But what about somebody our age? Like, why wouldn't we just go right to fixed position movements like a chest supported row? Why are we even doing barbell movements?
I don't have an answer for that.
That's exactly what Pat said to me too.
Yeah. Unless you're competing in a sport that requires you to perform that particular movement. And we see that in studies as well, that people who do squats as compared to people who do leg presses, the people who do the squats get better at squats. The people who do leg presses get better at leg presses. So it is, it's specific. As mentioned, strength is specific. It's specific for the load range in terms of the percentage of 1 rep max, and it's specific to the particular exercise that you're doing. Which is why, again, you can't do this whole loading sports movements to try and improve a baseball swing or a boxer's punch or a basketball player's free throw by using, bands or one of those donuts or, heavier balls. This is not the way you do it. You actually, it's detrimental for the nervous system for those very specific, the fine motor movement that's necessary to perform those exercises at an elite level.
Got it. So speaking of transitioning into training, let's say fighters or athletes, right? Training with Jon Jones and guys like Gordon Ryan, what did you have Jon Jones lifting like? What was his schedule like in the gym?
Yeah, Jon likes to lift, and Jon's competitive at everything. And so a lot of what Jon would do on video was probably more than what we'd want him to do. But he's just that type of guy. It's hard to control some of those people sometimes. It was funny listening to Buddy Morris talk about the fact that sometimes you're better off just staying the hell out of the way and not, trying to injure an athlete. But that was the biggest challenge with Jon. It was the first thing we discussed was limited physical capital and where to invest it, because he's got a lot of demands. He's got multiple training sessions a day, whether it's a strength training session or it's cardio or it's his sport specific stuff with wrestling and Muay Thai and boxing and the like. And some of those training sessions in the UFC training, fighting, are high fatigue. Wrestling, high fatigue. Jiu-jitsu, maybe not as much, depending on if you respect the fact that it's supposed to be a jiu-jitsu session. I've told a story in a podcast recently about Jon went to a jiu-jitsu session. Some 285-pound Division I NCAA wrestler matched up with him. And next thing you know, it turned into a full-on wrestling fight battle. Yeah. And I'm sitting over the side, the best laid plans. I'm just like throwing my little notes in the air, and it's like, fuck it, because
not much you could do.
And so, the idea is the same thing with the fighters. The big challenge with fighters is one of two things. Like with Jon, they want to get as strong as possible. And we know now that you just need to be strong enough, and getting stronger than enough isn't going to necessarily translate to improve your performance. And it might even be detrimental because the fatigue and accumulation, or the time and effort that you put into that improvement of a squat from 400 to 500 pounds, it'll take away. Obviously fatigue management becomes, a big problem, but also some fighters want to turn a weightlifting session, a strength building session in the weight room, into cardio. Yeah. And they want to do, they want to go from exercise, they want to bounce around from exercise and get, the heart rate way up and sweat a lot. And they always want to run around and do, 15 different exercises, like a little bunny circuit or something. And that doesn't help either, because we know that the longer rest periods help improve with the subsequent sets. And so that's the challenge on both ends of the spectrum. So with Jon, we tried to do chest supported rows. We would do a SSB bar box squat to try and take away a lot of that strain happens at the point at which you change direction. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the inconsistency with each rep happens at the point at which you change direction, because it's not the same every time. Some might be deeper, some might be shallower. I didn't mind doing shortened range of motion with Jon. If you wanted to go heavier, I would use spud straps so that the weight would stop. And he would just go down kind of under control, but not large eccentrics also, because those would increase fatigue. And so it would just be, under control, a couple of seconds, boom, and then press up out of it. So I would use a lot of mostly concentric from a shortened range of motion. And I know some people bitched about that on Instagram as well when we showed those videos, but
I saw that.
Jon doesn't need to perform an exercise with his limbs through as significant a degree range of motion, because he'll never be in that range when he competes. If Jon's knees are at 120 degrees, he's on his back losing the fight. Most of the time when you go to do a takedown, you're at 45. And that's where you need to be most explosive and the strongest to a point, as mentioned. So, we've tried to manage fatigue. A lot of his cardio was sleds or swimming, so that we could decrease some of the load from him. See if I wasn't pounding on the concrete with jogging. I'm not a huge fan of the repetitive decelerating force from running a lot of miles. Under those circumstances with all the other loads and demands on him. So fatigue management was as we started out the discussion today, load management is kind of sets you up for everything. And it goes across all the hard part is you get all the coaches together and we all think that what we do is the most important thing. Right. And so, we want to capitalize on his time and effort. But I had to have that discussion with the coaches, and I'm walking into a place, just legends, at Jackson Wink. Legendary coaches, legendary fighters, and I'm just some random powerlifter guy. But my experience goes back to obviously studying exercise science, but at the University of Oregon, but training football players and track athletes and fighters. I worked with Joe Hip. That's how old I am, and nobody will even know that name. But he was a champion boxer, held a couple of titles there back in the '90s, and so I've been working with fighters and wrestlers since the '90s. And but you have to be very humble and respectful when you're talking to people like this, because they're very successful and they're savages in their own right. They're also fighters. Both Greg Jackson and Winklejohn are both fighters, and I'm not a fighter. So immediately I have to try and introduce something that might not be consistent with their history. I said to them that I don't believe that fighters should fight to get in shape. I believe they should get in shape to fight. And they believe just the opposite. And so that was a hard discussion to have. And so they'll want to run training sessions for an hour and a half and, do 10 rounds. And I'm of the mind that you need to gradually build into that kind of volume. And I'm also of the mind that the fight at most is 5-minute rounds. And so I would want to increase the intensity within that shorter window rather than increasing the duration. That kind of gets us back to the volume discussion with bodybuilding and powerlifting. It's that I like to see more intensity and effort and frequency long before I would just add extra time, because I don't want to have him do more volume if the intensity is compromised. We say it with sprinters too. If you're training a sprinter for speed and you're out doing some 40 meters or some 100 meters, we just don't run too many hundreds with sprinters, to be honest, in training. But if you're running 100 meters and it takes a sprinter's record is 10 seconds, if they sprint and they're 10% slower than their fastest time, you're not training speed anymore. And so you have to be very cautious about, at some point they either aren't recovering fast enough, or they're just that however many sprints they can get within 10%. Now you're training speed.
Right.
And just like in bodybuilding and powerlifting, if you take too short a rest periods or you do too much volume, now you're starting to train things that aren't strength or hypertrophy. You're starting to train, is your creatine phosphate storage restoring? Are you have calcium channel ion buildup? Are you getting other substrates, like lactate, hydrogen ion, accumulation that's not clearing? Is your central nervous system not recovering in that period of time such that you can invest enough effort into the next set? I've said that each subsequent set, you shouldn't have a precipitous decline in repetitions with the same weight. Right. If you do a set of dips and you do 20 on the first set and then you only rest 30 seconds, you can only do 14 on the second set. You're not training strength or hypertrophy at that point. There's other things that haven't recovered. So you take the longer rest, as we know, the 2 to 3 minutes. Micah Marino used to come over during COVID, when all the gyms were closed, and he would train in my garage. I had a whole powerlifting setup in Las Vegas in my garage. I had all the weights and the professional bars and stuff. And I always tell the story. Micah Marino's workouts would take 4 hours. Jeez. But he would spend 15 minutes between the sets, just sitting there. One time I came out and he pulled 760 or something. And I came out and I watched him pull, and I'm like, it's great, ready to go. And I said, I got to go to Costco. He's like, all right, see you in a bit. I drove to Costco, went grocery shopping, and came back, and he was setting up for his next deadlift. And that had to be 25 minutes.
That's insane.
At least, maybe now, 30 minutes. Costco's pretty close to me.
What's the you don't recommend that? Like, what's the reason he's doing it? Just because he wants to take his time?
Yeah, just wanted to take his time. He was lifting heavy. Just wanted to totally, and he had a team in there, and they were all training together. But
yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, there's an extreme to that. But when I'm powerlifting, when I'm warming up, I'm on a 10-minute clock. I back into the equation of when I think I'm supposed to be on the platform. I back into the equation that I'm going to rest about 10 minutes between each set. And I've also talked many times about the fact that I don't want to create a pump back there. I'm not getting under the bench and putting 135 on and doing 12 reps. I don't want a pump. And I've said that, like, if you were working your way up on the dumbbells in the incline dumbbell press, and you grab the 60s and you do 10 and you rest, you grab the 70s and you do 10 and you rest, you grab the 80s and do 10, and then you grab your top set, the 90s or the 100s, and you can only do 6 or 7 reps, and maybe because it's bench, your spotter has to touch the last rep or whatever. You didn't do 4 sets. You did 1, and you probably compromised a rep or maybe some pounds by pre-exhausting yourself with all that volume. So I would never do that backstage in the pump-up room either. Matter of fact, I used to bench to a 1 board, and the first time I would touch my chest was on my opener, just because I loved the feeling of that stretch, the muscle just, you get that stretch reflex. I didn't want to blow that out. The extreme of that would be static stretching prior to sprinting. It decreases performance because you lose some of that stretch reflex. And so, and even on the squat, I would squat to a box that was 2 inches high, just touch and go. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't completely sit and go back up, but I would just do a touch and go to a box that was I knew was a couple inches high. And the first time I would hit depth would be on the platform. I would get down to that spot and I would do this little, because I went down kind of slow, mainly because if I went down any faster, I wouldn't be able to stop, and I'd just end up sitting on the floor. But I would grab that last little bit of stretch, and I could feel it, and it was awesome. And also warming up, I would do 1 rep with 135. I'd warm up a little bit. I'd do some this and this, and maybe a band or whatever. But I'd do 1 rep with 135 and rack it, and then I would rest for a minute or two, and I would do a second rep with 135. I would get under it and do a single again. And we've all heard of the post-activation potentiation, where if you lift a particular weight, then the next time you do it, this is usually like if you're going to do repetitions, if you're going to try and get a certain weight for the most reps. If you lift that weight for a single first, then you rest and do that same weight again for reps, that we see that in the research shows us that the weight feels lighter, and people do see an increase in the number of repetitions they might be able to perform.
Huh.
And so, then I'll throw 2 1/4 on, and I'll come down and I'll bench 2 1/4, and then I'll rest for a couple of minutes, and then I'll do 2 1/4 again. The second time I hit it, just flies off my chest. Huh. And I do that with squats. I do that with benches when I'm warming up. Of course, when you get super heavy, you got to be careful how many of those singles you're hitting. But it's extraordinary how much confidence you get psychologically from hitting it the same weight the second time and how light it feels. So if I go to the gym to do hypertrophy session and I get on the leg extension and I put the stack on there, I do 1 rep and then I go sit for a couple of minutes. Then I come back and I do, I can get 8 or 10 there. But when I'm doing it the second time, man, those first 6 or 8 reps it doesn't feel like anything.
You're priming your mind almost to hit the weight. That's so interesting.
Priming your mind. I mean, do you see that kind of, we've talked about this over and over again about how much of lifting is CNS, which is perceived exertion and the signals sent from the brain to the muscles. And just because you fail doesn't mean that your muscles can't contract. It means that your perceived exertion is shutting down what's going on in your brain. That's why some people can lift a lot more with lifting straps than with the hands, because we have that feedback that your body will at some point, it might be somewhat related to, maybe I'm outside of my scope here, like the Golgi tendon organ that gives you the feedback to tell you, it'll shut down your ability to contract because it perceives injury. And so this was John Perillo's whole thing about training the Golgi tendon organ. I don't know how effective that ever was, but it's kind of why you train with heavier loads, is because you don't want your body to perceive that load as being too heavy, or your brain to perceive that load as being too heavy, and then your signal shuts down. I think a lot of the failure has to do with that defense mechanism. We see it in pain research too, the biopsychosocial method for pain. A lot of it is signals that are being sent to your brain that you have to calm down because it's overreacting based on its perception of potential injury.
How much of the training plateaus would you attribute, you think, to the mind or the CNS really getting in the way versus the body's like physical strength adaptation?
I think it's most of it. I think it's most of it. You can obviously train yourself.
Is there a way to hijack that at some point, or what would you recommend for that?
Scott Mendelson used to carry around adrenaline in his bag.
That's insane. They sell that? Where do they sell that?
Crazy.
Where can I get that? CVS or no?
Yeah, I'm just saying that, and that's another reason why people take halo testing before a big meet, because what it does psychologically, not physically. It's another reason that people take caffeine, and that's why it works.
Right.
It just provides you some of that extra bit. That's why studies have been done repeatedly on people who drink carbohydrate drink prior to training versus someone who just swishes that same drink in their mouth and spits it out. They get equivalent results.
Wow.
It's a psychological stimulus. So I don't like going to the gym hungry, as mentioned. That's why I kind of like having a little bit of food or a protein bar or drinking those what are those hydration drinks, like a Nun drink or what's the popular one that Huberman's always talking about?
Liquid IV or
Liquid IV or
Element is a big one. Yeah.
Element. I don't know why I can never figure out LMNT or Element, what the actual name of that is. And those folks are great. They send me product too, and I sit here, I totally gas their name.
Quick plug though, that's for sure.
Yeah. I'm terrible. I'm gonna get fired. They're gonna stop sending me products. I couldn't even remember who we were. We sent him free. But the point is it tastes good. You're just in there, and it just kind of. I used to take caffeine theanine. If I took too much caffeine, I would get jittery. I was in the animal cage one year at the Arnold, and there's some video of me incline pressing 500 pounds. And I remember they handed me a drink. And, there's people just crowded around, and it's animal, and they're giving you a drink, and you want to do them a solid by actually drinking their drink. But I never consume those because they go, I can't drink alcohol for the same reason. They make me dizzy and lightheaded, and I get all jittery, and they just, I don't have any I haven't attenuated those kind of things because I never use them. And so I'm walking around, I'm kind of getting ready for my next set, and within like a minute or 90 seconds, I start to feel that sensation come, and my hands were actually shaking. And I get under the bar, and my whole body's shaking. And I remember Keith Williams was my training partner back at the time. He lifted off for me, and I was like this, and the bar was shaking. And I brought it down, and I thought I was going to drop it right on my face, the 500-pound incline. And it's just, those kinds of things work. I got the lift. I think I got a couple reps there, which was one of my little circus sideshow tricks back in the day. But anything that you can do, stress could be another thing that could weigh heavy. Hunger, obviously, hydration. anything that you can do to keep you, caffeine, theanine for me kept me focused. The theanine kind of kept me from getting all jittery, but it really kept me focused. So I would sit in the gym and I wouldn't clock watch. You know, the only timer I was watching was to make sure I didn't do my next set too fast. I'd always set like a 3-minute timer or a 4-minute timer, so I didn't work too fast.
So are you finding, I mean, do you have like a pre-workout you like to use that has caffeine, theanine in it, or are you just taking both compounds and buying them?
Yeah, I just take a pill. Yeah,
okay.
The salt tab.
Yeah, that's not exciting enough for people our age. We want something that tastes like grape and, you know,
I know. Crazy. Well, and I've worked over the years with Dr. Sandra Godick, who's a PhD in thermoregulation and hydration.
Yeah.
And she did a lot of the hydration protocols for Lane Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles and professional hockey players, et cetera. She says, you know, drink when you're thirsty, but she said if it's cold and it tastes good, you're much more likely to drink a lot of it. She's a very basic, simple person.
So you're saying, that's the issue with these things tasting so good, is you're almost over drinking and consuming liquids?
Yeah, especially with kids, because they don't have a good thirst mechanism developed yet.
Yeah.
Kids' sports is that you have to make it cold and you have to make it taste good, because then they'll drink more of it.
How often do you see people over hydrating or over drinking water?
I mean, I don't see a lot of it. For a while there were people carrying around jugs of water, and there's no special benefit to that necessarily. Obviously, if you're in a hot climate, humid climate, you're training twice a day, you're training with gear on like football players or hockey. Obviously UFC fighters, I mean, they're just drenching in sweat. You should weigh yourself before and after training and rehydrate, but it's best to be hydrated coming into training, because it's kind of hard to keep up with that.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you're in an endurance event that lasts longer than an hour, it's kind of hard to keep up with that. There's some tips and tricks that Sandra uses with her athletes to get them to hydrate periodically throughout events, every 15 minutes, you know, just 4 ounces or 6 ounces, and then a mix of carbohydrates, salt, and water to improve the uptake of the hydration from the small intestine into the bloodstream. There's a glucose sodium transporter that helps to accommodate that. And so they do blend the three together. That's why sports drinks, you know, some of them are usually too low in sodium to be ideally titrated, because they wouldn't taste very good. That's part of the problem, is that the salty ones aren't they don't sell very well. But if you mix the blends right as per recommended, then you can get optimal hydration from just a little bit. But your body can only take up so much of that at a time. So guzzling doesn't work. And so usually the athlete to do is start sipping an hour before the training session. And you don't have to drink a gallon. You don't even have to drink a liter, but you should drink something leading up to the session, and then something throughout the session. And then subsequent to the session, you know, the ISSN has a whole protocol for that, to where if you weigh before and after training, whatever weight you've lost, you want to replace. If you lose a kilo, you want to do 1.5 liters of water with 500 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium, plus you know, somewhere around 30 grams of sugar, all blended together, and drink that. And you can only absorb about 4 grams of sugar per minute, so you don't want to guzzle it. You want to, you know, gradually drink that over a 10 or 15 minute time period. Same thing with after weigh-ins. We have very specifically measured drinks for our athlete that they have to drink, over an extended period of time, and then periodically as they start to put on all the weight that they took off for weight cuts. I did it with lots of powerlifters as well, doing weight cuts for Larry Wheels and you name them. I've probably helped, Micah, of course, and just about every world record holder at one time in every weight class back in the day with weight cuts and refeeds. Dan Green would go from, one time he went from 247 pounds to 220 in 48 hours, weighed in at 220, and 24 hours later on the platform, he was 252.
That's insane.
Yeah, incredible. He carried so much muscle mass, and muscles where all the water is.
Yeah.
And so a bigger, more muscular athlete can lose a lot more water. I don't even want to use the word safely, but they can do it.
Sure.
Well, on that note too, so I have to do a lot of water cuts, and I've tried everything. I've done the saunas the day of the competition. I've done the typical gut cut protocols. What would you say is the most effective, while also trying to be mindful of safety, but the most effective, reliable method to use when trying to water cut? And let's just assume you're not cutting more than 5% of your body weight or anything like that. And then obviously assuming 24-hour weigh-ins without like an IV, or 2-hour weigh-ins without an IV. What would you say is the best approach?
Yeah, you said 2-hour weigh-in.
I have 2-hour weigh-ins. Yeah, that's why I had to ask.
Yeah, that's a whole different world. If you lose more than 5 pounds, more than 2 kilos, you're going to start to compromise performance. You can probably add that back. 2 hours generally becomes 4 or 5 hours. I got to be honest. I mean, by the time you get warmed up and are actually on the platform, and that's a sufficient amount of time with a good rehydration drink to put 3 to 4 pounds back on, and not compromise strength to any significant degree. But I wouldn't do more than that. I wouldn't do more than 2 kilos. More than 4.5, 5 pounds would be on the top end. As far as the water loss, as far as a 48-hour protocol for losing weight and gaining it back prior to weigh-ins and then subsequent to lifting, that's the big thing. Is, as with everything, and ounce prevention, get in front of it. On most of these protocols, I just encourage athletes to stay closer to their pre-water cut weight. And I also encourage them to get to that weight a month out. Because if you're cutting weight consistently over the last 30 days before the water cut, it compromises strength. It can compromise strength. What I found is if you lose the weight prior to the 30-day window and train at that weight for 30 days, you are able to hold on to more strength and probably even gain some strength back over the last 30 days, rather than constantly losing 2 pounds a week all the way up until the water cut. Some people lose 8-10 pounds in the last month. Really hard to maintain strength. And some leverages could even be compromised at that point,
Yeah.
particularly for the heavier lifters that have a little more mass, or certainly if they benefit from the extra water retention, those kinds of things. So I get into shape a little sooner. I do that with a little higher protein diet, and mostly with lots of neat. I just have them stay on their feet almost all day, rather than investing a whole lot of time and energy into certainly not too much like high intensity cardio or the like, and probably not on the same day that you train. Try and separate the cardio bouts. I do like to see some cardio in there, maybe some zone 2 for 20, 30 minutes, 3 times a week. But I like to separate that from the training stimulus by a day, if possible, at least 4 hours. And then, like you said, you eliminate fiber 4 days out. You take your carbohydrates out 2 days out, maybe do a little glycogen deplete 2 days out. Meaning go to the gym and just do a couple of little sets for each body part, because the glycogen is burned specific to the muscle that you utilize. A little rowing machine work, not something to tire you out or fatigue you, but just something to get some of that glycogen burned out of all the different muscles. We usually like to pull sodium out at that time too. And then, maybe do a sweat. I have a tough time with saunas because they kind of cook you from the inside out, and you end up really tired. People tend to respond better from hot baths because they're not as hot. It seems like the heat has an effect on your energy. Might not be as big a deal for powerlifting because you're doing, a few singles and you've got all day, and you're eating all day long as much as you can after weigh-ins and as much as you can after squats before you have to, after squats before you have to do your bench. You're eating again all day long. Time you get to deadlifts, you should be completely, time you get to bench, you should probably be completely refed and rehydrated. Maybe even have gained weight from where you were prior to your weight cut. But for fighters, man, it takes such a toll on their cardiovascular endurance.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Dolce is pretty well known for the salt bath, like you mentioned. Rubbing Abilene on yourself and just sitting with rubbing alcohol and salt in the bath. And Chael Sonnen talks about how he lost 8 pounds in an hour, and that was after sitting in the sauna, doing the typical way of running in a sauna suit and not being able to lose a drop. And then he sits in this bath and is drenched. So I think that's like the adopted method for fighters. And I would assume it works just as well for powerlifters. I wouldn't see reason. Maybe you lose too much if you sit there for too long, but I don't know. It seems to work.
Yeah, they can do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm cautious. Another big problem with powerlifters is the refeed.
Yeah.
They weigh in and then they go straight to IHOP and start jamming down all this stuff that they haven't eaten.
He would
Not
never.
me.
He would never do that. He would never go to IHOP. No way.
And they end up just totally bloated. They get diarrhea. They're just sick. And I've had guys that just couldn't make it to the meet the next day. Not my guys, but I've heard people tell me stories about how they went to IHOP. Your body just can't absorb all that stuff.
Well, I've heard you talk about the sodium dump. I mean, you guys are so dehydrated, and they take those noon tablets and they drink a ton of them, and now it goes right through them, and they're run to the bathroom.
Yeah, that's the problem. In my Iceland seminar, it's been 8 years ago. I had almost 7 million views now. I was talking to competitive athletes. I was talking to strongmen, bodybuilders, male and female, powerlifters, and so I talked about the importance of hydration in hot environments. I did a video, a rant on YouTube where I talked about salt. And I was cautious to say up front, if you're hypertensive or sedentary or you eat lots of processed foods, but if you're training hard and sweating a lot, or if you're getting ready for a competition and you're dieting and you're only eating whole foods, to add salt back. And so I made some recommendations. Usually about a quarter teaspoon of salt, up to maybe half a teaspoon, kind of depending on the individual. And the broader community, the academic community, the probably more so the medical community, took issue with that because of blood pressure, and completely, I think, misrepresented what I was saying. So, but I find it interesting now, all these years later, that a lot of the same people that were criticizing me have had people on their podcasts now that are talking about the fact that larger athletes need more, people who sweat and the like. And one of the folks that beat me up pretty bad was Jordan at Barbell Medicine. And I love those guys. I watch all their videos. I've been to their seminar, read their books. They got a lot out. But I just found it interesting that they recently released a pre-workout that has 500 milligrams of sodium in it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, but oftentimes a lot of the nuance is lost in the clips. And sometimes, I've heard myself say a gram of sodium, and that's too much.
Yeah.
Or a teaspoon of sodium is too much. Because like you said, and I did say in the Iceland seminar, it's not a more is better scenario. I had my own training partner dosed up a big dose of sodium, and then he texted me he wasn't going to make it. He was pissing out his ass. So,
it happens. We've all been there.
Yeah. It's just, if one's good, two is better, as mentioned in our opening conversation about performance enhancing drugs. So you just got to be cautious.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense when you dive into the literature. I guess when you're outside it, looking in, it seems like, what is he talking about? Which I want to get into the vertical diet. One thing I know you've discussed as well is about cholesterol, right? So assuming you're high cholesterol, your doctor tells you to stop eating fatty red meats and eggs. How do you feel about dietary cholesterol contributing to your overall cholesterol numbers?
Well, I know that's a hot topic on the internet. We've got a lot of folks that are making claims that cholesterol doesn't matter. But to be more specific, LDL-C or ApoB, which is the most accurate marker of atherosclerotic plaque, potentially atherosclerotic plaque burden. You don't want an elevated ApoB. It is an independent risk factor. It's not the only risk factor. The analogy I always use is if you're wearing your seatbelt and driving the speed limit, you can't still text while you're driving. These are all risk factors. And so things like high blood pressure, high blood sugar, things that compromise the endothelial lining, making it easier for the ApoB particles to penetrate the endothelial lining, are going to increase your total cardiovascular disease risk. And if I'm talking to athletes in particular who already have an increased exposure to health risks, particularly the big, heavy athletes I talk to, that's not one of the things I want to let go too high.
Sure.
And so, generally speaking, I like to have them eat less than 10% of their diet as saturated fat. We've got lots of studies. We have multiple converging lines of evidence now, both from epidemiology to randomized controlled trials to Mendelian randomization, from genetic trials of PCSK9 genetics, showing that even children, teenagers, accumulate plaque in their arteries if they're hypercholesterolemia, if they have hypercholesterolemia, a genetic precondition. Lane Norton spoke not too long ago, a year or two ago, about how he couldn't get his LDL down below 130, and he decided to go on a therapy. I think it was a dual therapy, ezetimibe and rosuvastatin. Very well tolerated, low dose dual therapy. One's not a statin, and one it kind of takes care of cholesterol absorption. The other one improves cholesterol clearance, and so very potent together. I'm not suggesting that people need to run to statins, but I don't think that you should let LDL go crazy and think it's not a problem. Some of the claims that are made are that it has to be oxidized, and that's not true. We don't see that in the children. Some of the claims are that you have to have damage to the artery before the ApoB can penetrate. And that's not true. Some of the claims are large fluffy LDLs as compared to small, large buoyant LDL compared to small. That's not true. All of those things, when you listen to the experts, the actual domain-specific professionals who published and researched this stuff, I think it's Cromwell is one. What's another one that name's escaping me? I just got too much going on in my brain. But there's always a topic that generates a lot of feelings from people on social media, and so it's kind of hard. Thomas Dayspring does a great job. He's got 5 hours worth of stuff with Simon Hill, another 5 hours with Peter Attia. These folks are experts, and they get into the nitty gritty about what the research actually says. And then there's a whole bunch of chiropractors and holistic health practitioners that like to claim otherwise, and they just really aren't professionals. They aren't domain-specific accredited professionals in that field. So I'm not telling you what Stan says. I'm telling you what the experts actually say and what the overwhelming consensus is of the body of literature, not a study here and there, but the actual body of evidence as interpreted by the people who are most equipped to do so, is that you should keep an eye on your LDL. So lower saturated fat, higher soluble fiber. And so I kind of start pulling butter out of the diet at that point, and processed fatty meats like bacon and sausage and pepperoni. So pizza's kind of gone. We also see a difference in the type of saturated fats that you consume. Dairy does not seem to have as much of an impact on LDL, especially low-fat dairy, but even high-fat dairy has a much smaller, because of the milk-fat globulin membrane that seems to protect it. But when you create the butter through churning, you destroyed that protective milk-fat globulin membrane. And we just see from, say, the Finnish study, I mean, they decreased their cardiovascular disease events by, I want to say 80% by having a nationwide intervention for, they were having extraordinary amount of cardiovascular events. And basically by reducing butter was the big one. And I know that study just came out within the last week that's gotten a lot of back and forth about replacing butter with polyunsaturated fats. And I'm not saying you have to eat seed oils. I don't like seed oils. They give me diarrhea. And so I just eat olive oil instead, or I just get the fats from the foods that I eat. Salmon, egg white blends, eggs are, this is where you get into 20% of the population are hyperabsorbers of cholesterol and might have an impact on their LDL from dietary cholesterol. But generally speaking, dietary cholesterol does not increase LDL or ApoB to a significant degree unless you're susceptible to that. So that's where blood tests come in. How do you know?
Right.
And then increase soluble fiber and avocados and but things like palm oil and things like butter, even fatty meats. But I guess it kind of depends on how you respond and what you eat them with. If you eat it with a lot of simple carbs, you're going to have worse problems because the triglyceride is going to elevate, and that's going to affect the fats, and you'll have more LDL as a result. I was going to say one other thing on the combination foods. Oh, I'm just going to say this with respect to sugar, that we do have plenty of research showing that, insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is an energy toxicity disease, and diabetes and insulin resistance is downstream from NAFLD, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as a result of fat accumulation exceeding that which you can store subcutaneously in the periphery, and then you start storing it viscerally, ectopic fat around the organs, and then liver, and then that spills over into the pancreas, and now you've got no place to put the sugar, and so you start to have insulin resistance problems. But it's downstream. You can actually accelerate non-alcoholic fatty liver disease at twice the rate by consuming too much saturated fat. You compare saturated fat to sugar, and you see NAFLD increasing at twice the rate of sugar. And that's why when I worked with Mitchell Hooper, World's Strongest Man, just won the Arnold Classic recently, which is a big congratulations. Shout out to him. He's just killing the strongman field lately. He said, I want to get bigger, but I don't want to get fat. And so, that was one of the recommendations I made. Let's keep saturated fats low. Let's not pound butter and bacon. Let's try and get as many low sugar fruits and whole grain carbohydrates in as we can until such a point at which you can't meet your calorie demands, and then we might have to introduce something on top of that. But he's able to meet it. Oddly enough, Hawthorne needs 7,000 calories just to maintain his weight, and Mitchell can eat 3,500 and maintain his weight. It's crazy.
That's insane.
Yeah. I don't think he went over 4,000, 4,200 for the whole prep, and he's 330 pounds. And it's crazy. Because I would shrink on 3,500 calories. I would lose weight, and I'm 220 pounds now.
Yeah.
And I would still lose weight. My metabolism's just wicked fast. I have to almost force myself to eat just to hold on to my weight.
So, in conclusion, you have somebody with high cholesterol, high LDL. Let's say, like the carnivore diet zealots out there that are eating a ton of red meat and eggs. Are you recommending they remove some of those higher fat red meats and eggs? Or are you just saying, hey, maybe add in some more soluble fiber?
I think you need to get the saturated fat down to below 10% of total calories. And again, that's aggravated by how much sugar you take in. And remember, and I said this in my Iceland seminar 8 years ago, and we just did recently have a study come out on red meat. It depends on what you eat with them. It's the total dietary pattern that matters. It kind of depends on what you eat with it. The fattier meats are higher in saturated fat. I always enjoyed like a 96.4 beef or bison is pretty lean, or a top sirloin steak. I've always talked about that since day one, and keeping fats reasonably low and keeping saturated fats under 10%. I have videos going back, 8, 9, almost 10 years now discussing that. I was never a high fat guy because I wanted the carbs for performance. Because we see an improvement in both short-term and long-term performance with carbohydrates. And again, a lot of it psychological, to be honest with you. We see a lot of improvement in recovery also with carbohydrates. We see we don't see as much muscle damage. We see less DOMs in recovery with carbohydrates. So I like Dr. Sean Baker. I was on his podcast, and I was on Paul Saladino's podcast. I don't want to say anything disparaging. Paul switched up after I was on his podcast. I talked about where you're getting your calcium, where you're getting your micronutrients, and he started adding some fruit and yogurt back into his diet, which I'd highly recommend. But I don't necessarily recommend carnivore diets for athletes anyhow. If somebody needed to do a heavy elimination diet, I refer to the carnivore diet as the ultimate elimination diet. I tend to go more towards the low FODMAP diet because we do have some evidence that show we have some proof in plenty of research from Monash University in Australia to show that the low FODMAP diet is beneficial for people with IBS. Plus, it's a lot more inclusive, and it's tended to be transitionary to get you from having gut dysbiosis or any other issues that you may perceive to be caused by some type of food and you don't know what it is. And so you do the elimination and then you gradually reintroduce. And so the meat by itself is over 50%. Red meat is over 50% monounsaturated fat. I said the exact thing in my Iceland seminar 8 years ago, which is the healthy fat. And so I don't want to pin it on just meat. I would look at how much, and I would look at what your again, people respond differently. Get a blood test. If your LDL is skyrocketing, then it's time to start pumping the brakes a little and say, well, maybe I better avoid the bacon and the butter and the ribs, and I can maybe stick with a little bit of the top sirloins. That should, you have to change one thing at a time, or you don't know.
Sure.
If you pull eggs out and you weren't hyper absorber of cholesterol from egg consumption, then you might be losing something from your diet that could be very valuable, the choline and the biotin and all the other vitamins in eggs. Reduce saturated fat to big picture. Reduce saturated fats to below 10% of total calories, and eat plenty of soluble fibers. Even psyllium husk as a supplement could be very helpful in that regard. And you might want to titrate that up over time, because if you pound yourself with 30 grams of psyllium husk day one, you're gonna be on the toilet for a while.
I'm sure. I mean, that leads us into the vertical diet. So for those that don't know, what is the vertical diet, and what was your diet like prior to this?
Yeah, I experimented back in the late 80s and early 90s with dirty bulking and over restrict. What I was trying to get, it was the gallon of milk a day. I had the ice cream shakes with milk and protein powders, and I was eating a Totino's oven frozen pizza at night with cheese all over it every night before bed, and I'd weigh myself every morning and every night, and I had to be a certain weight before I went to bed. And it was pizza, pasta, pancakes, it was burritos, it was everything. It was the it was the bulking diet, and I got fat. I got up to almost 300 pounds, as mentioned earlier, but it wasn't pretty. And that was back in 1995 or 96. But I was also going back and forth between powerlifting and bodybuilding, and so then I would diet down, and I would over restrict on the other end of the spectrum. I would eat my egg whites and chicken breast and tilapia and lots of broccoli, and I felt terrible. And my gut couldn't handle all the raw vegetables that I was eating at the time. And I lost a lot of muscle. I would lose a ton of weight really fast. And this went on all throughout the 90s amongst a lot of bodybuilders. And even now we talk about people who came into and out of the scene, dirty bulking, losing weight, and never seemed to improve year over year. I think that even Mike Israetel talks about that he, as a result of having bulked up too heavy, has some loose skin and some areas that he's unable to get as lean. I fortunately didn't experience a lot of that. I was still able to get lean, but I was kind of always a skinny kid, whereas Mike may have had a different genetic predisposition than I did. But that's really all that happens is there could be some hyperplasia there where you increase the number of fat cells as opposed to just growing and shrinking your existing fat cell stores, and that's not a good thing. And so that's how it started. And then the vertical diet kind of appeared from that. It was all the things that I had learned from all of the college and competing and coaching and collaborating with other great athletes, and ultimately connecting with Dr. Damon McCune, PhD RDN, who was director of dietetics at UNLV. And we spent years together training out at Las Vegas and kind of fine-tuning the diet to make sure that it was supported by academic literature, and put in over 200 citations. And the vertical diet ebook on the website is now 250 pages, and it covers a whole broad range of topics, as blood testing, and even things like PCOS and NAFLD and high blood pressure quick fix kit and high blood sugar quick fix kit. I've got all these different areas in there that address all this stuff. But the diet itself intended to be more diverse than the traditional guru diets for the bikini girls, which were over restricted, but also avoiding some of the pitfalls of dirty bulking. And so I tried to find the middle ground. It was more whole foods, less ultra processed foods. It was lower in saturated fat. It was had a variety of protein sources. It included salmon for omega-3s. I left the egg yolk in. I didn't demonize dairy, especially for women. I didn't demonize red meat, especially for women, iron and B vitamins, etc. I kind of built a foundation of carbohydrates based on high potassium carbohydrates first. That was the daily potato, fruits. Potassium was such a huge contributing thing for blood pressure regulation and even blood sugar regulation. And then from there, most of my people who are trying to lose weight stop right there. But I've got a lot of athletes who are large athletes who train sometimes multiple times a day, including CrossFitters. I work with a number of CrossFit national champions. Lane Johnson, of course, from the Eagles. They have a lot higher calorie demand, all the powerlifters and strongmen, to maintain their weight. From there, I used easy to digest foods, which can both be things like the white rice, but also the texture. Why I created the Monster Mash, because you find that if you blend a little bit of bone broth in with white rice and bison, that you can consume a lot more of that in a shorter period of time. It digests faster, so you can eat again sooner. And that was kind of the basis of helping my bulkers get bigger with or replace the amount of calories that they needed, but without eating a ton of the junk food.
Now, I mean, dumb question, but if you're trying to cut weight, are you doing the opposite? Are you making sure they're taking a nice piece of top sirloin and cutting it and taking their time?
I have a page in there that says weight gain and weight cut. And under weight gain, I've got Hofthor's picture. And under weight cut, I've got Tiny Tiff. I don't know if you heard of her, but she's a world record power lifter. And she competed in the 103 pound and the 97 pound class. Tiny little power lifter, just a stud. But you're absolutely right. If I'm trying to get somebody to lose weight, I'm using steak. Lean top sirloin steak, and I want you to cut it and chew it, and just the process, the mechanical process of having to chew, and the longer that it takes you to eat a meal, instead of using, say, orange juice yogurt shakes like I do to bulk, I'm using oranges, and which are really high on the satiety index. My bulkers are using white rice. My dieters are using boiled potatoes because they're real high in the satiety index. They just keep you fuller for longer. So those are some of the big changes. My dieters might drink some more iced tea and diet soda around meals just to keep them satiated. But that's the big difference is texture and satiety.
So just to like clear the air, I guess, in today's literature, red meat isn't necessarily bad for you. And I think a lot of people have that misconception.
It's all dose dependent. See, what's the overall dietary pattern look like? What kind of red meat? Is it processed meat, pepperoni, and that kind of stuff? Or even, I would suggest if you do have some sort of hypercholesterolemia or some sort of lipid elevation that you go to a top sirloin instead of a ribeye. But it should be part of a number of different proteins that you can consume to get kind of a more diverse diet. But no, we don't. In a healthy diet, dose makes the poison. We say that about everything.
Yeah.
We say that about aspartame in terms of sweeteners, and dose makes the poison.
Now, why cow red meat over, say, turkey, chicken, pork, things of that nature?
I think they're all good. I like the higher iron in red meat. I like the way it tastes. At the end of the day, adherence is the most important thing with diet. My book on the front, right under the title, it says simple, sensible, and sustainable. And there's a lot of ways to lose weight. There's many paths to the same destination. You can use a restrictive diet like keto or carnivore or vegan, or you can choose to do that. But what's the likelihood that is something that you enjoy that you'll stick with long term? Some people do, but looking at the broader population, all the research that we have on that even things like intermittent fasting, some people do. Other people, they don't enjoy it. And some people just count calories and just eat mostly whole foods and less ultra-processed foods and higher protein, higher fiber, and just manage their diet the same way they manage their checkbook or their bank account, just keeping track of things.
Yeah. How do you feel about fasting from an anti-aging standpoint?
I don't think there's any evidence, and I'm not the expert on that, but when I look at the work of Matt Kaberlein with the NIH, who's done most of the longevity research, what we see is, I think, from the bulk of the research, what it comes down to, from the body of evidence again, from the people in that field, is that in the absence of weight loss, it does not appear as though fasting has an independent effect on health. It's the weight loss, and that's true of any diet. And I know that I got lambasted on social media for saying that even the McDonald diet resulted in weight loss, also decreased blood pressure and blood sugars and lipids and improved all the health markers. And the very next statement on there, and that was 8 years ago again in one of my rants, what's the best diet? I said that I'd never recommend the McDonald's diet. It might have micronutrient deficiencies, might be too high in saturated fat. It might be, it's ultra processed. You might overconsume. Might be hard for satiety to adhere to the diet. But nonetheless, the fact still remains, and the experts who studied the research, they themselves conclude that 90 to 99% of health benefits are realized strictly from the weight loss itself, irrespective of the diet. And so I don't, obviously we'd like to eat healthier, but the weight loss seems to be the driver of most of the health benefits.
Sure. Now, what about the reverse? Somebody that's because everybody always talks about like losing weight is the best thing for somebody to do, assuming they're overweight. What about somebody that's underweight? Is there like a recommended diet that you think they should be following to make sure they're getting the amount of micronutrients they need?
Yeah, that's a big problem because that causes more acute deaths than in the short term than obesity does. Obesity is kind of a longer range problem with cancer, increased cancer risk exposure and cardiovascular disease. But that's a very dangerous situation. Usually that's more of a psychological problem than it is the dietary problem, and that professional counseling should be. Those folks tend to start demonizing foods or groups of foods until they're down to such a restrictive, and they have a really poor body image. A lot of that's psychological.
Sure.
I think you want to get a professional involved psychologically, and then try and slowly get them to incorporate a broader range of foods. Like I mentioned with the guru diet for bikini girls, I was never a fan of the over restriction. A lot of those people ended up on antidepressants, many of them, and some of that might have been precipitated by hypothyroidism, which results in hair loss and a host of other problems. So sleep loss, and so that's a terrible road. And I think that absolutely you should have a psychiatrist involved in that.
So I think what Stan is saying is that a gram of test is probably the best strategy.
Yeah, I need a gram of test is what he's trying to say.
Thank God for
taking notes.
I got to say though, thank God for like the CrossFit evolution for women in particular.
Yeah,
that it made the scale wasn't all that mattered anymore, and performance. And you saw how beautiful muscle could be, and so everything wasn't just about getting as skinny as possible. In the defense of the MPC, and I've been to hundreds of their shows with respect to the women in particular, I always remember that they told them, look, you're not going to improve your placings just by getting smaller and smaller and lighter on the scale. So if you want to change the way your body looks, you're going to need to get sorry, my other phone's ringing. You're going to need to add muscle.
Yeah.
And I think we know that by now.
Got it. Yeah, so they're doing their part, I guess, in mitigating the risk of any sort of eating disorder.
Yep.
In regards to somebody that has some sort of digestive issue, I know you worked with Gordon Ryan. I'm not sure how much you worked with him, but I understand he was following the vertical diet to an extent. Did you notice you had to do specific things with him and for him that...
Yeah, Gordon Ryan's wife handles his nutrition. He stayed with me for a couple of weeks in New Mexico when I was working at John's camp. I did have the opportunity to cook food for him and talk to him about nutrition. And he did respond well. I just asked him, I said, what's your goal right now? Do you need to gain weight, lose weight? And he said, I needed to gain weight. He was having a hard time eating. And so I said, well, just let me cook your food while you're here. And, I was able to use basically a low FODMAP diet and the Monster Mash and some other sandwich meals with sourdough toast as opposed to regular bread. Just some of the small changes that I used so that things feel a little better in the stomach. And he was able to increase calories and gain weight over the course of that time. And so, but his problem, his digestive problem is kind of, it comes and goes. And it can be pretty serious. So I'm not suggesting that a diet can fix what he was dealing with, but he prospered during that time, and had plenty of conversations with his wife on what equipment to buy and what foods to buy and how to cook them and what to look out for, and things that I've noticed have bothered my digestion and that of some of my athletes.
Yeah, so you're almost just mitigating some of the symptoms he was dealing with. You can't really fix or dive into. I'm sure that's a doctor's job at that point.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So what is life like for you now? I mean, I know you're, owning several businesses. You're a very busy guy. You're down in Samoa. What is like the day in the life of Stan right now?
but I'm embarrassed to say, they say, never meet your heroes. You'll be disappointed.
Yeah.
How far from grace can one man fall? I mentioned that I'm down to 220.
Down to 220.
And I picked up this. The problem is I picked up this nasty little addiction about a year ago. Living in Vegas, I lived right on Sunset Park, and Sunset Park has this big 26-court professional pickleball
I knew you were going to say it.
facility.
Oh, no. I was hoping you
And
wouldn't.
embarrassed as I am to say it, my wife introduced us, and we had some of the family and friends come over, and we had a little pickleball set up. I had a big driveway, and so we did pickle the driveway. Next thing you know, I'm getting lessons over at Sunset Park, and then we came down over last Christmas and visited here in Samoa, and they have indoor pickleball here, and they have a whole pickleball association and a bunch of players. And it's just, I don't know, it kind of satisfied my competitive urge since I can't lift shit anymore. And so, yeah, that's really my what I would suggest is most of my cardio these days. I learned that I haven't moved laterally since college. And once I started going side to side, I had all these pains that I never experienced in all of my years lifting weights. I ended up with a lot of foot pain and ankle pain and knee pain and hip pain, and even my obliques from twisting and what have you. I just had all this soreness, and I thought, man, I'm just getting old because I play too much. I go pound on the concrete. You go to a Sunset Park at night. They have lighted courts, and you'll play till 10, almost 11 o'clock at night. Sometimes you're out there for 3+ hours, game after game after game, and all the guys over there are really competitive. So I can't make it sound cool no matter how much I talk about it.
It sounds nice though, man. I gotta be honest.
It's gay as hell, but that's what I do, and I'm happy to admit it in my old age. But I train here in town. I'm in American Samoa, as mentioned. I drive a golf cart around the island. It's 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, and I take my kids back and forth to school. I got a couple Sea-Doos to hang out on the lagoon and run them around on inner tubes, and I swim and I play golf, and it's like a vacation that never ends. And the temperature here is 75 to 85 degrees, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and it's a volcanic island. It's just beautiful, lush, mountainous. You see some of the green in the background here. It's just and damn near all your food just grows right here on the property. Papayas and pineapples and coconuts and everything you imagine, fruits and vegetables galore. But I do train. I train, as we discussed earlier, with more frequency, less volume, in that 5 to 8 rep range, doing maybe 1, maybe 2 sets per exercise, maybe 2 exercises per workout. Usually it's full body Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but sometimes I'll do upper Monday, lower Wednesday, upper Friday, lower Monday. So I'm kind of on an 8-day split as far as my twice a week goes. And I'm still trying to push little, what I call PRs, my post-retirement PRs.
I'm right there with you. Yeah.
my AARP PRs.
Yeah, there you go. Sounds like you're living life, though. I got to be honest.
It really is. It's a good setup. So that's what's going on now. I'm headed to Canada next week to do some seminars, and then down to
very cool
Cincinnati. I'm gonna do one with Matt Wenning in Cincinnati, or in Canada, and then one with Matt Whittemer at Beat Training, my partner in training, Jon Jones and Henry Cejudo in Cincinnati. And so I'll be and of course I made sure I'm going to stay over in Vegas for 3 or 4 days to play pickleball at Sunset Park.
You got to hit the courts.
I'm trying to wrap up the book right now. Obviously, I have the meal prep company is still operational for vertical meals nationwide, sell Monster Mashes and 50 other meals nationwide. But I'm trying to wrap up a book called World's Strongest Diet that just talks about people, high school, collegiate, professional athletes who need to gain mass. And I want to cover it to make it really easy, step by step for them. So that's kind of my current book that I'm working on.
Have you found it difficult to monetize yourself and a lot of your coaching and the knowledge and the skill sets you've developed over time? Have you found it difficult to monetize that in the space, especially today? Because there's so much, I feel like there's so many competing voices. And despite obviously the very profound and massive impact you've had from just not even the general population, but even among elite athletes, it's still probably difficult to compete with that. So have you found it difficult to monetize that, or what does that look like for you?
There is a lot more competition for online coaching, and there's a lot more free information out there. I started my whole business by giving away free information. All of my seminars and rants and stuff is free. But I find that people like to have a reference, and so I do still do well with the ebook, particularly because I've expanded it over the years. Now in version 4.0, and I give it for free to anybody who bought a previous version. But it attracts people with a different variety of goals and age, because I address things like HRT and I address things like PCOS and NAFLD and those kinds of things. So that's been doing well. Online coaching is still as a result of, thanks to you guys for my invitations onto podcasts. A new audience sees me relatively frequently, and they'll come on, and I can work with them online. Most of the stuff I've done for the last 10 years has been online. I owned a gym in Las Vegas, but I didn't do a lot of one-on-one training there. I did have a kids power hour every Sunday, which is fun, watching the little ones run around, 6 to 12 years old and thereabouts. But I don't put out a ton of content, so I'm not really. I was fortunate, I became an overnight success after 30 years of competing. I was fortunate to have when YouTube kind of started, and my affiliation with Mark Bell and my IPB Pro card and my exposure on Shark Tank and in the magazines Flex and Muscular Development. I was fortunate to have had a pretty good publicity around me. And then I've done over 200 seminars in 17 countries in all 50 states. And so wow. I beat the streets pretty hard, shaking a lot of hands and meeting a lot of people. And I think the vertical diet it's at least the name is pretty well known in the industry, and largely because of some of the great athletes I train, Hofthor and of course Brian Shaw, who I used to work with, and the professional athletes and Mitchell Hooper and others, but Jon Jones, of course, that all helps. But the vast majority of what I do isn't with athletes, and to be honest with you, very few of the athletes pay their trainers because there's lots of people who work with them for free.
Well, I saw a video, not to cut you off. I saw a video of you and Alex Ramosi a while back on YouTube. And so it almost feels like there's like a second wind coming, and you might be kind of dabbling in the entrepreneurial arena and all that. Is that right to assume, or are you kind of your foot's on
He's
the
retired.
on
Look at his background. Where's he
playing
going?
pickleball.
He's playing pickleball. He's done.
I'm kind of still doing what I know works. I'm still, like I said, I recently rewrote the ebook. I'm going to write another book, and then I'll do Vertical Kids. They're slow going. I'm not going to release them very fast. My meal prep company still does well, and I still do online coaching. So, you said in not exact words, but kind of what my wife tells me, I've gotten pretty comfortable. I've been able to etch out a pretty good, I've been able to monetize myself pretty well, and it's been pretty consistent. And I'm not disappointed. I could do more. I see people in the industry doing a lot more who don't have my credentials, or maybe they have academic credentials, but not my competitive credentials, or worked with the number of athletes that I have, or been on the amount of podcasts, or of course Shark Tank was in 10 million homes. And I know that stuff might seem old, but it keeps getting replayed, and new people watch it.
Yeah.
I was reading the responses to an interview I did one time on podcast on YouTube, and somebody says, Stan just keeps repeating himself. And I'm like, well, yeah, because I talk about stuff that actually works. And, we've been through now a number of years of people just making shit up. And now they're starting to get stitched, and people are starting to call them out on social media. And it's all coming full circle to where everybody else is repeating what me and some other folks like me have been saying for 10 years or more. And it's the stuff that works. And it's, Lane's pretty good about that, about just talking about the grind, and not to get distracted.
But that's why it resonates.
What's that? Yeah,
that's why it resonates, because it's the truth. You guys are being authentic, and Lane and I have had that conversation before where, it's tough when you're trying to be a content machine and you're trying to provide value. At some point, it's hard to not add flavor, so to speak. But the truth of the matter is, people really do resonate with stories and with the truth, especially if it's going to benefit them. And that's exactly what you guys have done. So you've become pillars in the space in a way.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little boring, but I figure those people who've learned everything I have to offer, they move on, and then new people come in.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
70% of our population is overweight or obese, and 50% suffer from prediabetes or diabetes. And I don't think there's a lack of customers out there by any stretch of the imagination. However, however flooded we think the market is,
Yeah.
there's plenty of people who still need help.
Well, I think one of the most impressive things about you is that, you can watch a video from 10 years ago and it may seem redundant, but because it's the same thing over and over again, it's the truth and it hasn't really wavered. And you just mentioned guys we won't have to mention again who have to backtrack what they said a year ago, so kudos to you. And again, I've been watching your stuff for seriously 5 years now. I've been diagnosed with Crohn's for 10 years and 12, maybe 10, 12 years. And I remember I reached out to you through DMs about like a pretty intensive question. And you took the time to answer me. And so for that, I want to thank you again. Meant a lot. So the fact that you're on my podcast now is like super full circle.
Yeah, I still do I get lots. I'll get 20, 30 DMs a day. Some of them are, just comments, and some of them are asking, brief, quick questions. But I try and respond to as many as I can, as I did to you. I really do try.
Yeah.
So thank you. I've probably responded over the last 10 years. I bet I've responded over 100,000 DMs. And that would be conservative. Because if you look at 25 to 50 a day times, 3,000 days.
Yeah, don't expect anything else. He's busy with pickleball now.
You seem very busy. So no, we thank you for your time, Stan. Where can they find you? What's
Thanks,
socials?
Guys, I appreciate it.
You want to plug your social real quick for the audience?
Everything's at Stan Efferding. StanEfferding.com is my website. I have my meal prep link and my ebook link on there, my online coaching. At Stan Efferding is my Instagram. Stan Efferding is my YouTube. I have a lot of great rants on there. And I know they say 8, 7, 6 years old, as just discussed, but it's still some pretty neat stuff. I still enjoy it. I actually do want to go back and start to update it and put some nuance and correct some things I was wrong on. We all make mistakes. But I do think I'm going to reinitiate the rants. But that's everything I got, and that's where I'm at.
All right. We'll throw some links to the ebooks and all that in the description here. So
thank you, brother.
Thank you so much,
Appreciate it.
man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.